In this video, we're going to do a quick recap of evolution. Now, let's start by looking at what drives evolutionary change. And evolutionary change really relates to the environment. So the environment is selective. That means it can select out organisms that are able to survive in that environment or get rid of organisms that aren't able to survive in that environment. And organisms that survive are able then to pass those traits on to their offspring. And that's how a species will eventually adapt to a changing environment and become suited to that particular environment to survive in. Now, this is all to do with selection pressures. And selection pressures are anything in the environment that can impact the survival or the reproduction of an individual within that population. So selection pressures may be living things like competition from other organisms for resources, it might be from predators, or it might be non-living things such as temperature, rainfall, wind, sunlight availability, those sorts of things. Now, generally, the more genetic diversity within a species, the more likely it is to survive under different selection pressures. And the reason for this is because all of that genetic diversity means there's going to be slight variations from individual to individual, which is then going to increase the chance that one of those variations might be just the thing you need in a changing environment. If there's a species that doesn't have a lot of genetic diversity, it means they're going to limit their chances of being able to adapt and survive if there is an environmental change. So let's talk about adaptations. And adaptations are a characteristic that an organism has inherited and makes it better suited to survive in an environment. The key thing there is it's inherited. If it's inherited, it means it's going to be passed on to their offspring if it's a favourable adaptation. Now, adaptations can be behavioural, physiological, or structural. And if we use the grizzly bear as an example, a behavioural adaptation of the grizzly bear could be around its hunting habits or when it tends to sort of accumulate as much food as possible. A physiological adaptation could be to do with the way that the bears hibernate, and they go into that state after they've had the behaviour of eating a lot of food and then finding somewhere like a cave, for example, to hibernate for the winter. And then a structural adaptation could be things like their fur or their paws or things that have helped them to survive in that environment, which can be quite harsh and cold at times. All right, natural selection is part of evolution. And natural selection is when certain adaptations are inheritable, so we can get them from our parents and pass them on to our offspring, and they allow an organism to survive environmental selection pressures and then reproduce. So an example that we went through in class for this is to do with Darwin's finches, which is a really famous example of natural selection, where all of these finches at one point would have come across to the Galapagos Islands from South America. And depending on the island they landed in, on the type of food sources that were available, that they would have been naturally selected to have certain bill shapes and certain body shapes that helped them survive in the environment they found themselves in. So, for example, if it was an environment that had lots of seed around, then those birds with bigger bills that were able to crush those seeds were then more likely to be able to get the nutrition out of those seeds and therefore survive and, more importantly, pass on that trait to their offspring. So that eventually over time we ended up with a group of finches that had these bigger, stronger beaks. Whereas if they were more like an insect eater, then they might have more grasping bills, so bills that are good for catching insects and eating those insects as well. Again, if we're in an environment where there's lots of insects and no seeds, then these sort of finches are less likely to survive and less likely to pass on their bigger bill traits. Conversely, if these finches over here, the tree finches, ended up needing to eat seeds, their beaks may not be suited to that, and so that's going to be a selection pressure on them. So whether they survive or not is all part of that idea of natural selection. Now, Darwin's principles of evolution are really important to get your head around and understand. And a little trick to try and remember it is to remember the word vista, where each of those letters relates to a different principle of evolution. So the first one is variation. So variation is the idea there's differences between individuals in a population. These might be differences in size, these might be differences in colour, there might be differences in beak size and beak strength as different examples. And then the I relates to inheritance. So inheritance is being able to inherit those variations from their parents and then be able to pass those on to their offspring. Selection is part of Darwin's principles of evolution as well. This is the idea that environments have limited resources and there's more organisms that are born that can ever possibly survive in that environment. And so those organisms that have the more favourable variation and can pass that variation on are more likely to survive and be selected as the fittest for that particular environment. Remembering that fittest doesn't mean that they can run the fastest or jump the highest. It means their adaptations are better suited for the environment than other adaptations. And then it needs to be time for this evolutionary process to occur. So generation after generation after generation passes on these advantageous traits until eventually it ends up being an adaptation. So it moves from being a variation, where we might see differences in bill size, everything about the finches, into an adaptation when the majority of finches within that species, if not all of those finches in the species, now have that particular trait. It has now become an adaptation. All right, let's talk about this all together in relation to the cane toad and the red-bellied black snake. Now, the cane toad's been introduced to Australia. They're evolving quite quickly. They have very few natural predators in Australia, and they're starting to spread. And what's happening is the bigger cane toads are able to hop further, and they're starting to breed with the other bigger cane toads, and so they're breeding bigger cane toads overall that can move faster. So their spread is actually increasing a little bit. Now, red-bellied black snakes like to eat frogs and toads, and the trouble is when they eat a cane toad, they tend to die very quickly afterwards because of the poisonous glands on the side of the toad's head. And so this is having a selection pressure on the red-bellied black snake. And what we're finding is red-bellied black snakes that have smaller heads are starting to be selected for. And that's starting to become an adaptation of the red-bellied black snake. Now, the smaller head means that the bigger cane toad is not a desirable thing to eat. It's too big for the red-bellied black snake to eat. And so what's happening is those with the bigger heads that can eat the cane toads, they're being selected out. The ones that are surviving are the ones with the smaller heads. They're then able to pass on that smaller head variation to their offspring. And this has happened over enough generations now where this is starting to become an adaptation that we're seeing. What was once a variation in head size is now becoming more common in certain parts of Australia where cane toads are really prevalent. And it's a way that the red-bellied black snake is evolving to survive in that changing environment. All right, let's talk about some of the different terms that are associated with evolution. And one of them is divergent evolution. Divergent evolution is the idea that we have a group of species that have all evolved from a common ancestor. So they'll have some very common looking sort of characteristics. And we can look at the Galapagos finches as an example of this as well, where there's certain characteristics that they all share in terms of their body size and morphology like that, but there's a big difference in their beaks. And that's the bit that has been evolved, even though they've all come from that common ancestor. So we call that divergent. They've kind of diverged away from the original ancestor. And then there is convergent evolution. And convergent evolution was an idea that Darwin came up with to explain why organisms that are not closely related might have similar features. And this really reinforces that idea that the environment drives a lot of these processes. So here we have a picture of a shark, a dolphin, a penguin, and an ichthyosaur, which is a sort of dinosaur, reptile kind of fish-like structure, a bit like a sort of precursor to a crocodile, if you like. And they have very similar features that allow them to survive in their environment, even though they're not closely related in terms of evolutionary terms. So they all have fins, they all have streamlined bodies, and this allows them to survive and thrive in those aquatic environments they live in. So this is an example of convergent evolution. And then we have gradualism versus punctuated equilibrium. And this is a concept that different organisms evolve under different conditions. So gradualism, as is shown here on the left-hand side, is the idea that we have a common ancestor and there's some sort of slow environmental change, and so there might be some separation that causes a different speciation to occur here. And then gradually over time and over generations, we end up with organisms that are fairly similar but are now different species. Whereas punctuated equilibrium is the idea that there's been some sort of huge environmental change that has led to a rapid change or rapid adaptation of that particular organism. So something would have occurred at this point here, which means that a lot of the moths would have died off, except for these orange kind of shaped ones, which were able to survive that environment for whatever reason. So punctuated equilibrium is the idea that there's a sudden burst of evolutionary change, and then there's nothing that really happens much after that because the environment hasn't changed and they haven't needed to then drive that evolutionary change. All right, let's talk about some of the evidence for evolution. Now, one of the pieces of evidence for evolution is biochemistry. And biochemistry is really looking at proteins and DNA and looking to see how similar those sequences are. And this is from your textbook, but this shows an example here if we look at humans and chimpanzees, where the blue bits are the aligned sequences and the yellow bits are the gap sequences. And you can see just looking at that pattern there how similar the human and the chimpanzee is, even compared to the gorilla or the orangutan there. So biochemistry is all about the chemicals that we have in common, proteins, DNA, those sorts of things. Comparative anatomy is looking at how organisms are put together and looking for similarities there as well. Probably the most common or most well-known example of comparative anatomy has to do with the pterodactyl limb, which is the idea that most organisms, particularly in the mammals, will share these common sort of patterns in their limb structure, where they'll have a humerus, they'll have a radius and ulna, they'll have carpal bones, metacarpal bones, and the phalanges. And even though the shape and sizes of those will change between a whale and a bat and a human, for example, it's still that same basic anatomical structure. And this provides some evidence that maybe at some point there was a common ancestor that had this original bone structure that all of these different organisms have then evolved from. Vestigial structures are another example of evidence for evolution. Vestigial structures are things that organisms still have, even if they don't really need them anymore, they don't use them anymore. So in humans, we've got some rudimentary ear muscles that allow our ears to move, even though they don't move anywhere near as much as, say, dogs or cats that use that for positioning prey and that sort of thing. Things like our appendix, our tailbone, these sort of things are vestigial structures, signs that we've evolved from something in the past, but we still have these remnants of those things that we had that were useful with our common ancestor. Comparative embryology is looking at embryos and how things develop from the gametes and the zygotes into the organism. And so again, we look at this as evidence that there's enough similarity here, particularly early on in the development of the embryo, to suggest that that sort of pattern is probably not likely to happen at random. And so again, it's evidence that perhaps all of these organisms share a common ancestor if we go far enough back. Biogeography is another way that we can, or is another piece of evidence for evolution. And the picture I've chosen here is looking at some of the large flightless birds and where they are around the world. So we have things like the rhea that lives in South America, the ostrich in Africa. Australia, we have got the emu and the cassowary. New Zealand has the kiwi. Now, the thing that these birds all have in common is a lot of anatomical similarities in the way that they're shaped. And that's a clue that they're probably closely related, some divergent evolutionary type processes going on. But these are flightless birds, so it's unlikely the emu has flown here from Africa or South America. And so this kind of then pieces in the idea, because we know that these continents were connected at one point, that there was a common ancestor that perhaps roamed all of these continents as they were joined together in Gondwanaland or Pangaea. And in doing that, as these continents shifted and moved, the environments changed. So those birds had to change to then adapt to those environments. And that's why we have different species of birds now that are more better related, or more better adapted rather, or evolved to the individual countries, whereas previously, when everything was just one landmass, they would have been evolved to adapt and survive in that particular environment they're in then. And then we have fossil evidence. Now, fossil evidence can be really strong for some organisms and really essentially missing in other organisms as well. Key thing to remember for all the evidence for evolution is it's all part of putting a case together that gives us a good idea that evolution is occurring in the way that we think it is. No one single piece of evidence will ever really stand on its own. It's really the combination of these things that helps us fill in those gaps and understand how things have evolved. All right, so just some exam tips when it comes to thinking about evolution. It's really important to know the key terms of evolution: punctuated equilibrium, gradualism, divergent, convergent evolution. Understanding that VISTA, those 5 principles of evolution, is really important as well. And it's good to have some examples you can rely on in your exam. So you did a depth study this year where we looked at evolution in particular organisms. So that's one example you could have. Having one for a plant, having one for an animal would be really helpful. But also be able to apply what you know to different situations. So a question might be something along the lines of using a named organism, or we might give you a named organism we want you to talk about as well. So understanding these basic concepts of divergent, convergent, the principles of evolution, and understanding the evidence for evolution, and being able to apply those in different situations will be the way to make sure you feel confident when you're in the exam.